Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the ESCoE UNSW Economic Measurement Conference. This morning, delighted that we have Professor Quentin Grafton from the Australian National University presenting to us as a keynote speaker. Quentin has a lot of titles, so I'm actually going to have to check my notes here while listing them. He is a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. He's Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. He is the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in Water Economics. He's the convener of the Water Justice Hub. He's the executive editor of Global Water. And above all that, he played rugby with a former All Blacks captain. So it's just important to get that out of the way. Quentin is, as you can tell by his roles, he is a world leader in water economics, fisheries as well. If you want to go back and read some of Quentin's early work in fisheries economics, there's some great papers there, which I might have been a co-author on some of them. But just for young researchers, if you're looking for some firm-level data, really high-quality firm-level data, have a look at fisheries data, because fisheries are generally very well regulated, and so they've got great data there. Anyway, Quentin has worked in a range of different areas. He's worked on social capital, happiness, and today he's going to be talking to us about human well-being. Ladies and gentlemen, Quentin Grafton.
Okay, I think I'm switched on. Thank you very much for the introduction, Kevin. And for those people who were here yesterday when Tom Logden was presenting on energy and cutoffs, I just want to make a statement here. It's not perfunctory. It's not trying to impress anybody. But we are standing, or you are sitting, on Bidjigal country. And I want to acknowledge the elders, past and present, and this country that we live in has been inhabited by First Peoples for at least 65,000 years. And they deserve respect from our governments, from ourselves, and anyone else. So, I'm going to talk about global human well-being, and I'm going to motivate it by just bringing in some issues that I think you're all pretty much familiar with, but I think they're worth sort of highlighting. So there's a standard approach. I'm not suggesting it's the view in this room, but there's a standard view. If you read the IMF projections of economic growth, we've got 3% to go for decades to come. Or if you take an economic growth approach, there's a lot of potential to bring about, hopefully, convergence. Although at the moment we're experiencing divergence between countries in terms of per capita income. You have another view of the world, which is really quite different, which is looking at what's happening in terms of climate change, biodiversity, planetary tipping points, et cetera, which is a very diametrically opposed perspective. And so the point of this paper was to say, well, what does the data tell us? Okay, there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of projections, and there's some really good projections in the context of climate change that have come out in the last decade. But what is actually happening in the historical context? So that's the motivation of the paper. And then we'll take it a little step further, because 2025 is a point in time, depending however you want to, what date you want to start with, it's a point in time towards 2050, which is the big net zero. All sorts of issues supposedly happen by 2050. So it's worth looking out to 2050, the next 25 years. I don't want to go out to 2100. There's far too much uncertainty out to 2100. So we look at to 2050 in terms of climate change projections and see what the implications there are around different distributional effects at a country level. Okay, so that's the motivation. It's what does the data tell us? What do we find? And then we can take the next step, which we don't in this work, but perhaps in the discussions. What are the results tell us what's going on? And that's an even bigger question than what we've taken on in this paper, but it's worth obviously debating. So an outline is, well, I'm just going to talk to you about human well-being measures. So we've got a few human well-being measures, including GDP per capita, purchasing power parity, some stylized facts, which I've sort of given the game away. I'm going to talk about global human well-being, what the data tells us, at least comparisons across countries in 2019. 2019 is picked because it's the year before COVID, of course. We do have data beyond 2020. And then the trends, that's, I guess, is where we're landing, is the trends. What are the trends telling us? You know, have we done this in the right way? Maybe not. But what do they tell us? And then we go on and look at some of the issues around GDP per capita and these alternative human well-being measures. How connected are they? What's the correlation between them at an individual country level? And so we'll look at that. Probably not too many surprises there. And then we go into this issue of 2050. We could go to 2100. We have results to 2100, but I don't think they have a lot of value. For the next 25 years, a lot of things are set for the next 25 years. Fundamental things aren't going to change in the next 25 years. Okay, so I think it's useful. And then the last thing is to say, well, if you take these results at face value, if they have some value in terms of policy implications, what do they tell us? And then this leads to the issue of cross-country transfers, which has been on the table for a long period of time. But I would go back to the last two Conference of the Parties in terms of UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, when there was a proposal there to put a lot of money on the table by 2035. It hasn't happened yet. There's some money on the table. We can talk about what that means. Is it going to really help? What are the consequences around that? Moral hazard issues, crowding out effects, etc. So that's quite a lot to cover in whatever it is, 45 minutes or so. So let's put a perspective where we are. Obviously, we're on Australia, First Peoples country right now, but obviously we all share a common home, and what happens in one place does impact on other places, no question about it. So human well-being. When we drafted this paper, as a paper around this, one of the people said, well, what is well-being or human well-being? And so there are multiple definitions and dimensions around it. So I'm not suggesting that we've come up with anything new here. I'm just giving you a sense of what these dimensions are. What is missing here is the environmental dimension. It is implied in a number of those sections in some of those circles, but it's not actually there explicitly. And so human well-being is really an experienced and self-perceived measure of health in a broad sense and happiness. Okay, so it's a physical and mental set of well-being. So if we want to examine the issues, around well-being, we can't just stay in this issue of economic wealth and material wealth. We're going to have to go into some of these other dimensions if we're going to use the term well-being. Okay. So this is the Australian Treasury. So Australian Treasury has been working on this at least, I think, since Ken Henry's day as the secretary, which was quite some time ago. And so this is the 2023 version of this, measuring what matters in Australia. And so there's the healthy, secure, sustainable, cohesive, and prosperous. And I put in some possible measurements or indicators. They're not in any sense exhaustive. Healthy, well, life expectancy at birth is a pretty good measure. We'll be using that quite a lot, actually, in terms of this presentation. Obviously, morbidity rates are important. And then security, national crime statistics, ways of looking at what that means. Sustainability in the context of Australia, which is a dry country, subject to extreme temperatures, so heat days, stream flows in rivers, useful measures. Cohesiveness, cultural diversity, they're measures for that. And then prosperity, well, we can use GDP per capita. Understanding, of course, that this is not itself, by itself, a measure that's comprehensive enough if we're looking at human well-being. So let's start to look at some of the stylized facts out there. One interesting thing to look at is if you look at these countries, Australia's in here, and Catherine did a very nice presentation yesterday talking about life expectancy in Australia, which is continuing to rise. So we're in the lucky country in Australia. You can see the dips here, which are associated with mortalities associated with COVID, particularly in 2020. Although in Australia's case, the dip was a little bit later in the context of the different policies that were followed. You see these dips, and you see a very large dip in the United States. And then the United States stands out in other ways, and you'll see it in some of the trends that we're finding here. The stature of people in the United States has peaked already. And Vogel's work looking at nutrition, and there are issues around why that might have happened, and we can talk about that at the end, I guess. But it is closely connected to life expectancy as well. And so that peaked at sometime in the mid-1980s in the United States. And so that perhaps may be part of the explanation in terms of what's going on in the United States in terms of life expectancy at birth. Of course, this is an average. And so if you look over at different demographics in the United States, or indeed any other country, you'll find that it's not uniform. Obviously, there are some groups that are suffering quite a lot in the context of stature and then life expectancy, and other groups not at all. And then this is from the World Bank. You'll be familiar with it. It's the middle income trap from a couple of years ago, World Bank development report. And it's also sort of in another context from what I'm looking at, it's not, which is a well-being context. They're looking at it from per capita income and looking at the sorts of things that countries need to do to get itself out of. So if you look at the figure here, this is the 1990 level, and this is the 2022 level. So certainly some countries have pushed themselves up, which is a good thing for them, but a bunch of countries haven't. Okay, so they're trapped, so to speak, according to the World Bank. And there are various policies that the World Bank is proposing: innovation, infusion, investment. The 3 I's is how they described it in this report, in terms of trying to boost GDP per capita and get out of the so-called middle income trap. So you're coming in from different perspectives. There's something going on in the world, whether it's life expectancy issues in some countries, GDP per capita in some countries, a middle income trap. And then I'll look at the next thing is the HDI, which includes GDP per capita, or actually gross national income per capita, with education and life expectancy at birth and a geometric mean. I'm putting it in here not because I think it's the best measure of human well-being. It's just it's the most widely used measure within the United Nations. They always refer to the HDI. It's a bit hard in terms of these periods of time, but you obviously see some dips happening around 2020, but also you see some flattening, perhaps, in some places. And some people have used the HDI measure to say, well, perhaps the human well-being is peaking. Again, this is the motivation for the work. And so the question is it? And if it is, where is it? Okay. And then how fast is it happening? I mean, those are the sort of key questions that we're trying to answer in this piece of work. So I always love to put this map up for our visitors from the Northern Hemisphere to get a better perspective of where we are in the world. Some people put Australia right in the middle. Of course, you can do that, but I wouldn't want to be so nationalistic as to do that. Okay, so let's start with some measurements. So what's being measured? Okay, and let's then see what these measurements are telling us in trends over time. Okay, and across countries. That's really where we're heading. First one is GDP per capita and purchasing power parity. Okay, so I'm an economist. We're in a room of economists. Absolutely needs to be there. And it's a major focus in terms of the work that we do here. Second one is something that and there's some health economists or two in this room, I think it's a really, really important measure. It doesn't change dramatically, although we did see that in the COVID space. It really is important because it has a whole series of things that are interacting with our human well-being. Obviously in a pandemic context, but also in an environmental context. There's also in the context of GDP, income, wealth, etc. There's a measure I put in here, not because I think it's a particularly great measure, but it is a happiness index. Okay, and there's a lot of work, Easterlin's work and others sort of say, well, if you get more money, are you happier, sort of stuff. We investigate that, by the way, and you can see our results. I'm not going to make a conclusion on it. In fact, there is no conclusion according to our results. I give the game away. But it is useful to put it in here because it is this idea of self-perceived or self-perception and how related it is or not to some of these other measures. And then, of course, there's the Human Development Index, which I've already talked about, which the UN uses. And then there's this other measure, which we've put in here because it's really quite a composite measure. And it does include some measures in there on the environment, which is not true for the other measures, only indirectly to the extent that they impact, let's say, on life expectancy, etc. So those are the measures that we're going to use, and let's see what we've found. So obviously, I'm talking to an audience of data people. You don't always get the data you want. It's not for the time periods that you want. It's not for the extent that you want. So you can see here that the longest time series here are both GDP per capita and life expectancy at birth. So we focus in on these two measures. Okay. These measures are also used, but they're used in a different way in terms of looking at human well-being. And particularly this measure here, the life evaluation happiness index, it's just for a very short period of time and a very relatively small number of countries over that period of time. So here it is. Here's the first piece of information. This is no trend analysis. It's just simply letting the data tell us what's going on. And so we make comparisons across the world. Okay, so these are no data. Okay, a bit awkward. But this is below the 25th percentile, and then here's above the 75th percentile. Nothing new in this that you don't already know, but obviously there's a bunch of countries that are well off in an income sense. North America, Western Europe, Australasia, and there's a few others as well, Japan, South Korea, etc. That's a good news story for them, but it's not a good news story in terms of differences, particularly in the African continent. Not exclusively so, but certainly the most number of countries below the 25th percentile is in the African continent. So there's big differences, and these are just on percentiles, but they're big differences in absolute terms, very large differences. Okay, so per capita terms, I think the per capita income in Switzerland is, I think it's 80 times higher than it is in Haiti. So they're large differences. And then we go over here to life expectancy at birth. And you get a similar sort of story, but not exclusively. I've already highlighted, I won't be focusing on the United States, but I've already highlighted there is something going on in the United States. Okay? So the income measures are just fine, but something in terms of life expectancy at birth that I've highlighted. And there's studies that are showing that. So yes, still high, but not in the top 75th percentile. Australia pops up again, Western Europe, all good, all happy stories. Then we do HDI. We shouldn't expect too much difference there. It's a geometric mean of gross national income per capita, education, and then the QLI, quality of life index, not too much difference. Bottom line here, there appears to be strong correlation between these different measures of human well-being. So if people critique GDP per capita purchasing power parity, and a lot of people have, you can say, well, actually, if you use other measures, it's not too bad. There seems to be quite a strong association between them. The other thing that behind this is that there are consistencies across these measures between countries. Again, the African continent stands out, although there's no data here in relation to that indicator. So big differences as of 2019. So now let's look at trends. What's the data telling us? And remember, this is a question that we posed. We didn't have the answer to the question. We motivated the question. The question was, is average or is global human well-being peaking? Question mark. Okay. This is the data we've used. These are the trends we're going to look at. So we're using trend analysis. Okay. So we've got half a dozen ways of doing this trend analysis. I'm just simply showing that this is one of the ways we do it in a sigmoidal or logistic or Gompertz type of approach in terms of looking at what the peak might be. We're reaching some asymptote, and that would be considered to be some peak, whatever that might be, GDP per capita, life expectancy at birth, etc. And then here's some illustrated data. This is the best case scenario in the context of analysis, not in terms of human well-being at a global scale. So we got some ups and downs, which we would expect, some peak level, and then perhaps some decline. This is purely for illustrative purposes. Not that difficult to actually work out what the peak is, and we can also calculate what that peak time is as well, okay, within some boundary. And then here's the series again, and then here's what we're finding or trying to find. Okay, so to the extent that there are issues with the data, to the extent there's issues around how we've done it, we are obviously going to get around uncertainty around that peak value, as well as peak time. So there's 6 ways that we do this. The first 2 ways are the first order difference equation, and the second is a second order difference equation, and the other one is logistic type growth. One is just simply the difference, and the other one is a growth rate. Okay, so we do those estimates, and we only do the estimates for GDP per capita purchasing power parity and for life expectancy at birth, because they start in 1990. We've got data goes beyond COVID. And so it allows us to, and it's got the greatest comprehensiveness in terms of the countries. So that's what we do. We do for those 2 measures. And then we'll look at GDP per capita and the other measures of human well-being. And just see how they connect or don't connect in the context of the trends. Oop. Okay, so here are the core results, I guess. So remember, we've done the trend analysis 6 different ways. We've got 2 series, GDP per capita, life expectancy at birth. We've got a bunch of countries. And what do we find? Well, okay, so now rather than doing percentiles, I'm actually using these absolute amounts. So we call these the upper high income countries. They're greater than 40,000 USD per person. And these are the happy countries, I guess. There's several of them, and you can see them here. Australia's one of them, Western Europe. So this is the happy state in the context of when we peak and at high levels. But we've also got peaks that are much, much below the upper higher income levels. So according to the trend analysis, there's going to be a bunch of countries that will peak at high income, but certainly not at the highest levels of income. And there's a bunch of countries that it looks like they go, and you see them, they predominate in the African continent, that it seems that they're going to peak at levels that are well below what we're experiencing in Australia, most of Western Europe. And there's an unfortunate number of countries that are going to peak at very low levels, low income levels. Okay, so what this essentially says or shows, according to the trends, is that we've got the re-emergence, if you want, of divergence. So no, this is not convergence, this is absolutely divergence if you accept the approach that we've done here. And now that's just GDP per capita. Now we look at life expectancy at birth. Again, you see there's a difference here. The US does stand out. US maintains itself at a high income, peaks at a high income, but the implication from the trend analysis, the US life expectancy at birth is going to peak at less than 80 years. Okay? Whether that's true or not, we don't know. Of course, that's just what the trends are telling us. And we see this also in the context of 60 to 75 years and less than 60 years. So there's a bunch of countries, most of them in Africa, but not exclusively so, that have life expectancy peaking at less than 75 years. Again, that's a big difference, several years difference between upper high income and like Australia, for example, and countries in the African continent. And then here's the issue around timing. So when does this happen? If it happens in 2150, I guess, does it really matter? It's a long way away. But no, it appears as though we picked the 2050 that year as sort of the next 25 years, as far as we could it's one generation ahead. And the happy story, again, for a bunch of countries, happy story for Australia. So not only does it peak at high levels in life expectancy at birth and GDP per capita, but also it's going to peak beyond 2050. So happy state for Australians, I guess, on average. But that's not true for a bunch of other countries. It appears, again, we can dispute what the trend analysis is telling us. There's some countries that appears to already have peaked. And that peaked at low levels. There's a bunch more countries that are going to peak before 2050, and some surprising countries in that group. And then there's the life expectancy. A similar sort of story, but not exactly the same story. Again, one thing that stands out is the United States looks like it has peaked. Again, we can dispute that, but a bunch of other countries are peaking. Whether that's the case or not, we can dispute it on the context of how we've done this and our trend analysis. But the bottom line is, the question asked was, is global global human well-being peaking? And the answer is, well, it depends where you are. So there's a bunch of countries that I would call, or we would call, flourishing countries that are doing well and will continue to do well for at least 25 plus more years to come. There is another group of countries, languishing countries, if you will, that aren't doing well at the moment, that doesn't look like they're going to do much better, and will likely peak in the next 25 years if they haven't already peaked. So that's essentially the bottom line story. So if you take an average is obviously confusing at a global scale. What does an average global human well-being mean? If you split it up in that way, then I think that's the bottom line story. And so that has all sorts of implications for human well-being, human welfare at a global scale. It's positive for a handful of good countries in the context of this trend analysis, like Australia, but not good news for a whole series of other countries. And so now we want to take a look at human well-being and how it relates to GDP per capita. Okay, so what we're going to do here is do a couple of things. Okay, so there's three figures for each of these human well-being measures that are not GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. So this is just simply a cross-country comparison in 2022 between life expectancy at birth and income. So you can take that whatever you wish. There appears to be a relationship between increasing GDP per capita and life expectancy. It seems to be quite a positive relationship. That's just a simple cross-country comparison. These are the estimates for the individual countries. Okay, so it's not a global, it's an individual country comparison looking at the correlations between GDP per capita and life expectancy over the time periods that we have. Again, tells a similar sort of story, highly correlated. There are some exceptions going on here, but highly correlated. And then if you use the best fit slope for those individual countries, and we take that best fit slope, you'll see again that it's a positive relationship, but no surprises here, that declines as we increase GDP per capita. So in other words, yes, GDP per capita does improve life expectancy at birth, but as we get to very high levels of GDP per capita, it really is not making a lot of difference. Okay, so the big difference at the low income levels. And so we go over to here and do the quality of life index, and I'll just focus on B and C and see what they tell us. So some disparities compared to the life expectancy at birth. There's some substantial decline differences here, so not always positively correlated. But overall, if you take the individual countries, their best fit slope is still positive. It's increasing as we increase GDP per capita. Okay? But again, the story is similar in that sense that a marginal increase in GDP per capita at high levels of GDP per capita increase the quality of life much less than we're at very low income levels. Again, perhaps no surprise, but a similar sort of result to the life expectancy at birth. And then here's the HDI measures. Others have done this before us. You see, probably no surprise given that gross national income per capita is part of the index of HDI. You see a high correlation, very high correlation here. Again, best fit slope for the individual countries. Much higher impacts on HDI at low levels of income, declining, still positive, but getting very, 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 very low impacts as we increase per capita income to the very high or upper high income levels. And then here's the, so I was talking about happiness and Easterlin, etc. Again, look at figures B and C. There's no obvious, as far as we can tell, there's no obvious association. Yes, there are some countries where it's strongly associated in terms of the so-called happiness index with GDP. Yeah, but that's true, but there's a whole bunch of other countries where it's not, okay? And so you can see this in the best fit lines. There doesn't appear to be any what I would call global relationship, okay? And that's interesting because Easterlin's work was done originally with the United States. So the fact is that you can find a relationship and what that relationship is, that either there is no relationship or the contraire is that as you increase GDP per capita, you can increase happiness, and at what level. There's a lot of work done in that space. The fact that it can happen for one country doesn't mean that it's implied for other countries. There's clearly great differences across the world here. So no association that we can talk to, at least at a global scale. Again, this is important because this is this issue about, I'll get to it shortly, about this issue about global transfers. What does that mean? How would this improve global human well-being or not? So before I get to the global transfers issues, let me just now go into projection mode. So all that we've seen so far has just been historical trend analysis. There's been nothing about the future. I mean, obviously, we're projecting a peak GDP per capita and life expectancy at birth, and we also have a time period, but that's just based on the historical data and the trend analysis. What we're going to do now is something a little different. There are lots of climate change projections and impacts on countries at a regional scale, maybe not so much at the granular level, but there's lots of them out there. And so one of our co-authors here, Tom Compass, has published in that space. He updated one of his models for this work, so it's an extension of work that was published in 2018, 2019. And so we've used those projections to 2050 to be able to look at the implications in relation to human well-being to 2050 based on climate change projection impacts on GDP. Okay, so those are the projections that are out there, out of the model. As I said, it's been published, but it's been extended. And then you've got all our measures of both peak and actual levels of human well-being, and we're going to connect the two. And just see where's the biggest impact in terms of climate change for the next 25 years, according to those projections. It probably won't come as a surprise to you, but it's worth going through this a little detail. What we find, and again, it is in the literature, but these are new results in the sense that there are particular projections, and it hasn't been done in the context of all of these well-being indicators that we have. So in that sense, it's new, but it is consistent with findings others have come up with. So basically what you find that there will be climate change impacts, no surprise. It will affect GDP. This is to 2050, and they can be substantial. Okay? These are not trivial impacts, but, and here's the big BUT, but the impacts appear to be at a greater level and the proportion in terms of GDP on the low-income countries. Okay, so if you're a low-income country, you would expect to have a bigger climate change impact on your GDP per capita than if you're a high-income country. All countries will suffer, but the low-income countries will suffer the most. Not only do they have the least, but they'll suffer the most. That's essentially what we're finding with this here. This is life expectancy at birth. So again, these of course are correlated. We've already seen that. So if you take a life expectancy at birth in 2022, again you find the same sort of thing. Again, not too surprising given the figure A. We find that those countries that have the lowest life expectancy at birth are also going to be those countries, by the way, they're going to suffer the most in the context of the GDP impact of climate change. So not a happy story for those countries in the low-income group. Here's the HDI, a similar sort of story to what we have up above, so we don't really need to spend time on it. Some differences there, but a similar sort of story. And then the quality of life index, again, a similar sort of story. But you again see some of these impacts. They're big impacts, particularly for these low-income countries. And then this is the peak. So that was the 2022 measures that we had. So those are the actual measures. These are the peak measures. Remember, the peak measures are the ones that we estimated. And again, it's not a happy story. So we find here that those countries that are peaking at, these are the low-income countries, less than 4,000 GDP per capita. These are big impacts for them. Obviously, all countries suffer here, but the highest income countries, they suffer the least proportionally, plus they have the most ability, I guess, in terms of their wealth and per capita income. And again, you see a similar story with life expectancy at birth. So the story there is, if you agree with our trend analysis based on historical data, and then we go out to 2050 based on climate change projections, if you accept those climate change projections, okay, then it tells us that the divergence or the differences that we're currently getting, emergence of divergence, is likely to get worse, not better. So that bifurcation, if you will, if you want to have the flourishing countries and the languishing countries, the expectation is, based on our work, is that it's likely to get bigger, not less. So it's a divergence story, not a convergence story, which is not a happy story. So we're coming to the end of the presentation. So I felt that when we came up with these results, we couldn't just sort of, I'll just walk out the door now, Kevin, and leave. So I think there was an obligation on us to say, well, what are we going to do about it? Now, remember, we haven't answered the why. Okay, that's the big question. That's happy to talk about. Now, obviously, I've got ideas about the why, but if you accept that the trend analysis, there's still something to be done. Okay, so what to do. Well, we're not the first to think about this, obviously. There's been lots of work thinking about, particularly in the climate change space, what can be done to provide assistance for low-income countries primarily to manage with climate change. A lot of that is around adaptation issues. It was agreed at COP29, so not the most recent COP, that there would be an agreement in principle to undertake large transfers from high-income countries to low-income countries. Those transfers are large. Okay, we're talking in the vicinity more than $1 trillion, but they wouldn't start immediately. They were aspirational out 10 years' time. And so, taking that as a base, we've said, well, okay, who would pay, who would get it, and how big would those transfers be? If that were going to happen, okay? I'm not saying that's going to happen. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that those transfers won't take place in the way that they've been agreed to, based on historical agreements that would go back to 2008 and before, where countries haven't typically delivered on what they said they would do in terms of their promises. That's not they delivered zero, it's just they haven't delivered what they said they would do. Okay, so here's some countries here. These are the upper high income countries. This is looking at, this is their estimated peak levels of GDP. These are large, high levels. Singapore, Luxembourg, Ireland. And then we have here the annual net contributions. So these are non-trivial. These are percentages. So it's 2.6%, 3%, 3.4%, 3.8%. And I'm not suggesting that politically that's viable, but those are the sorts of measures, sort of transfers that would be required from the upper higher income countries. So it's only the upper higher income countries, $40,000 per capita, that are actually paying into this fund. There are potentially a range of countries that are high income, but not in upper high income, which aren't included in here. And so the relative proportions would decline. And then I guess the more important figure is the benefiting countries, the ones receiving the transfers, which of course the low-income countries, less than $4,000 per capita. And it's percentage-wise, this is just looking at net transfer per capita. That's not right. So this is not this proportion here is not correct. Okay, so for some of these countries, those transfers are enormous in proportion to their GDP, like 50% plus in some cases. So that's not right. The scale here is not correct in terms of if you're looking at their global trends. So that's not correct. But so there's a whole set of countries here, a lot of them in Africa, Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique, etc. Those transfers are very, very a large proportion of their GDP per capita. So small proportion, relatively speaking, for the upper high income countries, very large amount for the low income countries. So that's one way. So rather than leaving you hanging and saying, well, this is what we found, and walk away, consistent with global agreements, there are things that could be done. These is who would pay, who would receive. Sorry about the scale on that, that's not right. It is a very large impact on those low-income countries. Whether it happens or not is another matter. It's not something that I can resolve. Okay, so let's quickly go to the findings and conclude. Okay, so what did we find? I think there's 5 sort of key findings. Okay, so if you put it all together, that real GDP per capita and life expectancy at birth together, it seems to have peaked before 2050. So it's in the process of peaking. We're not saying it's peaked yet, although it has for some countries, for about 2/3 of the world's population before 2050. That's not even looking at climate change impacts. Okay, so that's saying that global human well-being is peaking. If you want to take it as a majority of the world's population, the answer appears to be yes, it is peaking. That's our conclusion from from our analysis. And importantly, it's peaking at levels much below the upper high-income countries' measures of human well-being, which includes Australia's included in that group, that fortunate group. So the term that we use is that we call them the flourishing countries. So high income, good, high level of life expectancy at birth, increasing, likely to increase beyond 2050. So it's a happy news story for them. But there's a much larger group of languishing countries which are not in that happy state. So divergence, I guess, is how we would describe it. And then we looked at GDP per capita because there's a lot of critiques around what it is in terms of an appropriate measure for well-being. So we looked at some other measures and found, yes, it's not a perfect measure, but it's strongly associated with HDI, life expectancy at birth, and quality of life index. Although the impact of an extra dollar gets much less as we get into much higher levels of income. Which is relevant. I can have that discussion when we talk about global transfers. But no general association with the happiness index, even though it does exist at a positive and also a negative at individual country scales. And then if we talk about projected climate change impacts, I didn't put in there what the temperature rise, which is the typical way of measuring this. We have a 2 degrees by 2050, a little over 3 degrees by 2100, which is fairly consistent with where we're tracking. And certainly with accelerated warming, it seems more and more likely it is 2 degrees warming at a global scale before 2050, which is obviously worrying for all sorts of countries and everybody, but should be even more worrying for low-income and lower middle-income countries that will suffer the biggest impacts, at least in terms of our projections, out to 2050. So in other words, on the historical trend analysis, we've got a problem. Point number 2. Point number 4 is that this problem is likely to get bigger in the absence of something else. And then the cross-country transfers. We could do cross-country transfers. We didn't invent this. Obviously, it's out there in global agreements. Relatively small if it's based on climate change. It's 2 to 3% from the high-income countries, but it's much higher than that for the low-income countries. It's very large amounts in terms of their transfers. How it's used, of course, depends on how the impact on human well-being in those particular countries. So that's it, Kevin, and thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Great, thanks, Quentin. A lot to contemplate there. Are there any questions from this happy group? Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. That was very interesting. If we go back to slide 21, there's in the middle graph, there's a country on the bottom right that's an outlier, and I think in the other graphs.
Which one is it?
So in the one in the middle, the bottom right outlier. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you know what country that is, and.
Oh yes, this one here. I get my artery. I don't know. Look, we do have all of this available by country, so, and it is actually downloadable, all our results, and as well as the MATLAB code. So I could look, but I don't have it. I don't know what that is. I honestly don't know.
Great question.
But a good point. I mean, I think one of the things to highlight here is that, that countries are very different, okay? So when we talk about global, and global trends and stuff, it's kind of a challenge to talk in that space. These are big differences, on the positive correlations and negative correlations. But, how we think about it, and as I said to you, there is nevertheless a clear trend. It's positive in relation to quality of life index, and it's declining as we get higher levels of income. But looking at individual countries, and no doubt in the maps that you can point out, country X doesn't look right to me. And I'm not going to defend a particular country, and all I can defend is the approach that we've taken. I think from my perspective, it's not that an individual country can't do something different, and I'm no doubt there will be. We've got, whatever it is in the UN, 200 approximately countries in the UN, so no doubt countries will be able to do good things and make a difference in the next 25 years. What we're simply saying is, at a global scale, it's probably not going to happen across the whole group of, let's say we call them the languishing countries.
Thank you, Quentin, for a really interesting presentation. I have 2 points, one of a more general nature on the choice of the variables, and another one which is slightly technical and actually at the margin. On the choice of the variables, when we did work at the OECD on measuring well-being, I mean, there seemed to be a sort of a consistent message coming out from various studies that what matters for people, 3 things. One is sort of material well-being. Yes. The second one is health.
Yes.
The third one is social connections.
Yes.
Okay. And now you cover the first 2. The third one you don't cover, I mean, for obvious reasons, but I think there's really something to do there, including things like personal safety and security. That all comes in here, which does affect to a great deal how, I mean, the personal subjective well-being, but is a very significant part of how people feel, how well off they are. Sort of on the first, so you cover the material well-being with GDP per capita. I would have a preference to cover this with consumption. Oh, if you look at the PPP figures that are published, and you have both, you will note that the top countries on GDP per capita are not the top countries for consumption. You have all the oil-producing countries in there, and you have what the OECD calls investment hubs. Okay, yes. And so the fact that the GDP is huge tells you very little.
Ireland, for example.
Yeah, that's a good. Okay, it tells you very little about how well off people are. And you got the same data, so it would just be interesting to cover this. It's easy to do. My second point is a small technical issue, also to do with the PPPs. Of course, if you do projections forward of GDP per capita at PPP values, in a way, and you keep the PPPs constant at 2017 level, you're ignoring a sort of ingenuity that happens and that we also observe, namely that as countries get richer, their price levels go up as well. Okay. In a way, it worsens the story, so it doesn't reverse it. Okay, but the convergence is slower than you might observe if you keep it. Now that's hard to resolve because you can't model this easily, but it's just something to keep in mind when you interpret the data.
Okay, thank you. Very good comments, especially on the consumption side.
Thank you. 2 thoughts. In the first part of your presentation, you showed us different approaches of finding peaks, one of which had a peak and then a decline, and one where the peak appeared to be more sustained.
Yes.
And first question is, do you see a differentiation in your results between those countries where you see a peak and a decline and a peak and a sustain? I think my second question is probably related to Paul's, because I was thinking about aging demographics. So taking a hypothetical scenario where everyone in Australia has retired, output would be 0, consumption would be high, imports would be where you get the consumption from, so GDP would be negative. Now, that's a sort of an endpoint, but with a larger and larger aged population, you're going to have this big drag. And I'm just wondering if you'd controlled or thought about controlling for the age of the demographic, because for those of a working age, you might still see productivity growth and rising consumption patterns.
Yeah. Yeah, both a good comment and a question. So yeah, there were countries that have an historical peak. And so when there's a peak in the decline, so we picked the historical peak in those countries, for those particular countries. Some countries we couldn't get an estimate, so they're not included in our results. So we couldn't get a trend that could be estimated, we did not include it. And then there was some rules that we used in terms of which, whether they were an acceptable estimate or not an acceptable estimate, to try to control for some of the deficiencies that perhaps in the data.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. Similar to the other points, did you look at poverty rates or measures of distribution, income inequality, or is that sort of captured implicitly in some of the measures you did use?
Yeah, it's only captured, I think, a little bit in the quality of life index, but that's a very large composite measure, which does include some of this issue around social cohesion, but again, it's just part of a much bigger composite measure. So no, we did not. That's a really important set of issues because we especially as the point was taken about consumption vis-a-vis income, the poverty rates do therefore matter, and what's happening in terms of poverty rates. But again, the measurement experts in the room, I'm not one of them, but how you measure poverty is a huge issue, which is sort of something that I could climb into and trying to get familiar with, but it's a big, as some experts, as I said, in the room could tell us, but it's a big issue about how you measure it, especially across countries and over time. So I think we chose to just put that to one side.
It might be easier than measuring happiness, though.
Yes,
which you do use there. So
yeah, well, we don't use it for the trend analysis, but we did put it in there. With the point earlier about what is the social aspect of it. So the material, the health, and then there's this social aspect. That's essentially what the LEI, the Life Evaluation Index, is trying to do. But as you saw in our analysis, although it's strongly associated with GDP per capita, for example, in some countries, it's strongly negatively associated in other countries. And no, so again, I'm not sure where it lands in that space. But obviously, if we feel more secure, it is going to presumably have an impact on how we feel, in terms of happiness, which is and some of those factors presumably are coming into play when we see the Life Evaluation Index. Crime rates, for example, what's happened to crime rates, that can have an impact irrespective of what's happening to GDP per capita.
Two things. The first is a shameless plug. You do life expectancy, which is across countries. We're beginning to calculate life expectancy distributions within countries, yes. And as part of measuring what matters in the health section is a chart which shows the Treasury's framework, and we publish the dashboard, and we've got a chart which shows deciles of Australian life expectancy by the socioeconomic status of the suburb you lived in. And it is, as you would expect, monotonic in the sense that if you have the lowest status suburb, you have the lowest life expectancy, and it's monotonic all the way to the top. And I do think it's a kind of interesting area to kind of think about and maybe do research on. I guess I was reasonably encouraged. The gaps are not huge. Well, it depends what you think. I mean, but for instance, I think all the deciles are above average US life expectancy. Every single one, all 10. I think that's correct. So there are bigger differences across countries than there are. It depends how equal you are as a country. But I do think that's an interesting area for research, looking not only at means but distribution. So that's the first point. Can you bring up the GDP losses from climate change?
From climate change, yeah.
Yeah, that's them. So, if I understand this correctly, this is a level impact,
Yes.
right, over 25 years, right, from now to 2050.
This is an impact on the impact on.
The level of GDP in 2050.
That's correct. Relative to current GDP or 2022 levels. So in other words, there's a percentage impact that's coming out of the climate change projections.
Right, but that's relative to no impact from climate change, isn't it?
That's correct.
Right.
Yes.
So in the background is GDP growth.
Correct.
Okay. So at the biggest, we're talking about 10-ish% over 25 years. It's right. This is a level effect over 25 years.
At 2050, yes.
Yeah. So in other words, we're talking about a deterioration in the growth rate of about 0.5% at maximum.
That's right.
correct,
So
isn't it?
the impact for the high-income countries which haven't peaked or
is much smaller.
It's tiny.
Yeah, absolutely.
So whilst the countries that have already peaked, it's even bigger. Yes.
That's right. But so for the high income countries, we're talking about a level effect of maybe 5% over 25 years, right? So that's a 0.2% per annum deterioration in your growth rate average over that time. And for the poorer countries, it's more like 0.5%. So the point I wanted to make was, if you think about differences across countries, even at similar standards of living, different sort of social constructs lead to enormous differences in productivity growth rates. So you compare what Korea has achieved over the last generation with what Somalia has achieved over the last generation. We're not talking about 0.5% GDP per capita growth. We're talking about maybe 4 or 5% per annum. So I guess in a sense, it's saying these numbers are worrying, but they are swamped by what you could do if you can change the internal structure of your economy to be more growth friendly. And the same is true if you look at differences in productivity growth within a country. I mean, there were extended periods when Australia's productivity growth was of the order of 2% per annum. It's now, well, you can make up a number, it isn't very big. And much of this is completely unexplained until it happens. Nobody's very good at this. And you could imagine, for instance, AI being sufficiently a big deal that it offsets this stuff.
Okay, so let me respond to that. I think we're more or less in agreement, though I'll put some nuances in terms of my agreement. So first of all, I think one of the points is that if you're in an upper high-income country and you're continuing to grow, these impacts are pretty trivial. So absolutely agreement. However, if you've already peaked, so the difference between those sets of countries, the flow.
At all, it's a huge deal.
It's a huge deal. So I think the story is more or less correct in what we're trying to tell. In terms of what countries can do, and I sort of try to say that in the presentation, individual countries can do a lot, okay, depending on the decisions they choose to make. Now, obviously, some are more constrained than others. If you're in a particular part of the world in geography where there are big climate change impacts, you can't change your geography. However, you can do a number of things. Bangladesh, for example, some of you may be familiar with this. Bangladesh still suffers from very bad floods. Okay, it always has and continued to do so, and will get worse. However, the mortality associated with floods has declined dramatically because they have these cyclone shelters, they have early warning systems, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's been some expenditures and investment that Bangladesh has done, but it's been allowed to respond in an effective way. So even those are impacts on GDP for the low-income countries. There's a lot of stuff that they could do that would have an impact both on, let's say, life expectancy or quality of life in terms of adaptation, which could be helped by these global transfers. So it's not all doom and gloom. I'm not just saying it's set, but it is certainly a bad news story for these countries. But It's not like they can't do anything. I think there are good stories we can tell where countries have been successful at responding to, let's say, climate change impacts and adaptation space.
Eric.
Thank you, Quentin. This is very nice and interesting topic. I have one quick question. I assume that the data actually used starting from 90s, right? Starting from the 90s. I mean,
Yes, 1990 for GDP
the
per
interesting
capita.
point was when you're talking about the solution, talking about the transfer, but starting from 90s, the actually trade protectionism, comes in. I'm more interested in your view in terms of how this free trade type of things may affect this projection, or to what extent that it played the role. Because if you're talking about 70s or even early, free trade, it comes out, facilitate the convergence. My second quick point was that, when you're talking, I really like your idea about the international transfer system. But if you look at the current forecast, it almost just from the very rich country to the very African country. Yeah. Well, without much of the involvement of the new industrialized, in particular the Asian countries. So to what extent, I would say, because they are accounting for a large of the growth over the past 20, 30 years, to what extent those countries getting involved into the transfer system, China, Vietnam, or other countries, will affect the whole picture. So.
Yeah, no, the good points. So again, if we project out from 2025 to 2050, which is as far as we go, there's lots of stuff that could be done at a global scale, in terms of free trade. Obviously, there's been movements in the wrong direction in the last little while. But there's also a bunch of stuff that could be done not only at a global scale, but also at an individual country scale. I highlighted the World Bank, the investment in fusion and innovation. They talk about the 3 I's. I think that's a fairly good story. Vietnam has taken that seriously in terms of its structural reforms and of its government, which is in process at the moment as a means of overcoming what could be a middle income trap for Vietnam. So I think there are a bunch of things that could be done at global and individual country level. So I agree with that. I think the other point you were saying was around. Yes, of course. Yes, so I'm sort of. So we just picked the upper high income countries because they're obviously the most well off, so to speak. But yes, we can. The code allows us to create any set of countries and how we would do it. So we could go down to high income, more than 14,000 USD if we wanted to. And obviously, more countries, proportional amounts would be less, at least from the upper high income countries. The way we did it, the more you have, the more you contributed. So it's not like China would contribute the same as Australia on a per capita basis, even though you've got a bigger group of countries that wouldn't be the same proportional transfer, although China would contribute, no doubt, more in the absolute amounts. We only, as I said, we could do it slice and dice in a number of different ways. And we did, before we presented this, we also said, well, what level should we go to? Is it 4,000 or should we take it further up? Of course, it makes a difference.
Neil.
Thanks for this, very interesting. Could I just get you to pop back to one of your correlations between GDP and any of the indexes? Anyone will do slide 22 maybe? Oh, that's as good as any. Yeah, that's as good as any.
Yep.
So all of those correlations are inverted parabolas, as you can see, and in a sense that's sort of a little bit counterintuitive because it implies that if you were to push GDP out to say 240, you'd have really unhappy countries there. And the reason that curve looks the way that it does.
You're talking about A.
Yeah. But the reason that those curves look the way that they do is because basically you've got 4 outlier countries which have got reasonably high GDP, but not a reasonably high HDI or LEB or whatever. And I was just wondering if you've done any sensitivity analysis on what your curves would look like and what your equations would look like if you just took those 4 out. I've no idea who they are because you said you sort of don't know, but it is quite curious that you do have 4 outliers that are kind of bending the entire curve. So
Yeah, good point. So this is, as you highlighted, this is just simply the correlation between cross-country correlation between income at 2022 and HDI. We didn't spend a lot of time on this. We put it in there because with the Easterland paradox and others have said they've just simply taken these cross-country correlations and used it as to say, well, look, it's going to bend over, whatever. We didn't get into that space, but because it's out there, we've included it. So when we talk about this, more in the supplemental material that we have, we focus on these, which are not cross-country. They are the individual country estimates. And so when I presented it, that's where we land. But no doubt, there's a lot of stuff we could do. And since we've only got 4, we could play around with this a little bit more. But it's not the focus of our storyline. It's simply in there because, well, some people have done that and they've used it to make some claims about a relationship. So we put it in there for that purpose. This is the one. B and C are really where we interestingly enough, I mean, not for the HDI, but there's a book that just come out. Is there a Norwegian in the audience? You know what I'm talking about? No. There's a book that just came out. It's in Norwegian. It's not in English. It's being translated. It's going to come out. And so it's a Norwegian economist from NHH, the Bergen School of Economics. And he makes a claim. I'm not accepting it or refuting, I'm just saying, but it's been a popular book in Norway. He makes the claim that Norwegians are too rich. So his claim is that the income increase over the last, there's a period of time, I don't know, it's 10 or 20 years, that further increases in per capita income in Norway have actually reduced overall well-being. And some of the measures he uses, again, it's in Norwegian, so I've just got some paraphrasing of this, is obesity measures and something else, and a few other measures. So he says Norwegians have become too rich, so if we had less income on average, they'd be happier. Now, I'm not into that space. I'm just saying it's an interesting sort of Easterland paradox on steroids sort of thing. But it's an interesting thought around some of these issues about well-being. And I don't know where Norway lands, but it's so obviously up here. Yeah.
Maybe it's the speed with which you accumulate wealth that really influences things. That individuals who win the lottery are not necessarily immediately happy and can become miserable by having this sudden wealth, which completely changes their lives. So I guess this Norwegian guy, we wait for his book to be translated because my Norwegian is not that good. But maybe it's a similar argument that society is not keeping up with the growth in income. Got time for a last question? Oh, yes. Okay. Callum.
Really good talk, thank you. When it comes to the relationship between sort of growth or income level and happiness, there seems to be like 2 stages. The first is you get happier as you increase health span, you buy cheap drugs, you get penicillin, blah, 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 vaccines, etc., etc. That's a really good value for money. Then after that, you're buying your 3rd plasma screen TV, not really helping much. When it comes to that and the effects from climate change, there's the consumption aspect, which is you seem to hedonically adapt to. That would explain the second half. Then the health things you don't tend to hedonically adapt to. Thinking about the other effects and the other aspects of well-being, thinking about climate-induced migration, food shocks, volatility in food prices, is that a larger effect than the sort of consumption reduction, especially when you're above that, say, middle-income threshold?
It really applies to low-income countries. So it's quite a different paper, but it was published last year, which looked at the food security issues out to 2050 and beyond. And again, it's kind of an unhappy story for those countries that have low income and import food. And there's a bunch of countries in the African continent that are in that space. They are going to have a major challenge in terms of food security. So what does that mean? It means that it seems likely that food prices will rise, at least on some key commodities, out to 2050. Or if they don't rise in a uniform way, there'll continue to be spikes. And we've seen them before in the 2008 on oil prices. So those price spikes will have a big impact on those countries that aren't able to feed themselves sufficiently and don't have the ability to absorb angle curves and all that sort of stuff in terms of the proportion of their budget on spend on food. So yes, I think that's not in this work, but it's a complementary work that indicates that there are some real issues that they're going to face. So what does that mean? Certainly for those countries, they're going to have to improve their domestic food production, I would think, to be able to try and meet that gap on the imports if those price spikes, which we think are likely, increasing number of them and high-level spikes associated with, let's say, global drought events. And since the paper was published, there's increasing evidence that this is a real concern. Again, there are responses. I'm not saying that these are fixed in stone, but so global soil moisture is declining, and it's declining in a fairly rapid rate. Again, when I say global, it depends where you are in the world. But that has all sorts of implications. So the way to get around declining soil moisture to maintain yields or increasing yields is, of course, to use more water. But there are some places in the world there isn't more water to use. So declining soil moisture and there's no more water to use, you've got a big problem, especially if you want to feed your country or your inhabitants. The only alternative, of course, is to import or eat less, which is not what I'm proposing. So I think there's a whole series of issues that need to be thought through about what to do over the next 25 years. I don't want to leave this sort of, I see some unhappy faces here, maybe because I've talked too long. I don't use the term hope because it has a whole series of connotations and toxic hope or whatever you want to call it. But I would use the term that these things aren't fixed. Okay? We can change them. I mean, that's why we propose these global transfers. Individual countries, like I mentioned, Bangladesh, they can do a lot. But the lowest income countries, particularly those countries in Africa, will need support. A country at $2,000 per capita GDP hasn't got a lot of resources to be able to do the climate adaptation that is required. So they will need support and that support could have a huge impact on the well-being of those individuals. And certainly for the small countries, low populations but low incomes, those are trivial amounts of transfers relative to what upper high income countries have. Obviously there's a whole lot of conditions around it. Just sending money into a country doesn't fix a problem. It has to be how does it get spent, all of those conditionality around that. But I think there's a lot that could be done, should be done, and can be done between now and 2050 and beyond. But if we don't do it, so this is sort of the unhappy note, Kevin. But at current trends, that's the point. On current trends, it is a very unhappy story. I'm not saying the trends are fixed, but I'm just saying on current trends, it's an unhappy story. So we have to turn this around. That's basically how I would like to. We can turn it around, but we better turn it around. All the consequences for more than half the world's population are not going to be happy. Yeah.
Very thought-provoking talk, Quentin, very challenging as well. So let's digest that over morning tea. Please join me in thanking Quentin.
Thank you very much. It's great.